Today we're going to be exploring responsible breeding to improve canine welfare, particularly with a focus on improving health and reducing inherited disease risk in pedigree dogs. So I'm going to start by just getting you to have a little think. If I can get this to change, here we go. So have a think about, when does concern for an animal's welfare begin? And here we're thinking specifically about dogs. It could be for a new owner when they first see their new puppy, maybe if it's advertised online, as many are internationally now, when they first go to pick it up, potentially at 8 weeks plus in the UK. It could be at birth, when many people believe that sentience begins in animals. Or is it before then? Could it be just prior to birth? Makes us think more about how animals are born and whether that has a welfare impact on them or their mother. Or could it be sometime during pregnancy? Do we worry about puppies and mothers during this process, going backwards? Do we even worry about an animal's welfare during conception? Or even before that, when there's still a twinkle in the eye of their breeder? Do we care about breeder decision making and its impact on animal welfare? So we'll touch upon different points of this cycle throughout the next hour, and I hope that everybody can reflect a little bit more about how these different stages can impact a dog's future welfare. So from a kind of broad animal behaviour and welfare science point of view, we often think about input and output based welfare assessments. And when we think about welfare inputs for canine welfare, we might think of some of the obvious points. So thinking about good veterinary care, I'm sure provided by many people in the audience today, nutrition, appropriate behaviour and training, their rearing environment. So we saw that a lot last week with Candice Crony's talk about early life rearing environment, and also their adult environment. But we also have to think about the genetic inputs that we as humans, who are in control of the breeding of dogs as a fully domesticated species, the inputs here can have profound effects on a dog within their lifetime and into future generations. So this is both within and between breeds where we see differences in genetic health. Now, selective breeding in dogs is an incredibly powerful tool. I don't expect you to be able to see or interpret the entire figure on the left, but this is just to show the many breeds that we have as humans across the world and their relatedness. And selective breeding can do some great good. It can be used potentially, as we'll talk about today, to reduce the prevalence of inherited diseases. It can also be used to potentially put selection pressures upon traits that we value in dogs. So, for example, good temperament that is suitable for families with children. That's a trait that is valued in dogs worldwide. But it also has great power to do some really big harms to animal welfare in the future of these dogs. And many of these impacts are related to what we might think of as anthropocentrically driven selection decisions. So this is where we're selecting for things that we want as people, but actually could run counter to a dog's future welfare. And we'll talk about this a lot today in terms of both inherited diseases at the genetic level, but also conformational traits. Over the last 10 plus years, particularly since around 2008, there has been really strong focus on pedigree dog breeding, particularly in Western Europe. Back in 2008, there was a primetime documentary on the BBC, one of the biggest broadcasting channels in the UK, called Pedigree Dogs Exposed, which, as the title implies, exposed many of the potential harms that were being done to pedigree dogs across the world because of the way that we were selecting for them. That led to an awful lot of interest and an awful lot of scientific discovery. And indeed, myself and several of my other colleagues probably wouldn't have ended up working in this field if it wasn't for the increased attention that came from this. We saw reports being put out across the world, including independent inquiries into what were the implications of pedigree dog breeding and what could we do about it. And we've also seen major campaigns, including Love is Blind, a campaign in Australia, and the BVA in Britain's Breed to Breathe campaign, all trying to raise awareness of some of the problems inherently associated with selection for specific breeds. So back in 2009, a fantastic colleague of mine, Professor Lucy Asher, was then a postdoc at the RVC, where I work now, and conducted with a team led by Professor Lisa Collins a systematic review trying to identify inherited diseases in the domestic dog and then categorise them depending on what their mechanism was and what was the origin of those diseases. And we can see this painted a pretty grim picture for domestic dogs, with almost 400 inherited disorders identified, some of which were thought to be related to body shape, these ones on the right, which I'll explore later, and others that were related to factors including inbreeding, which we'll explore in just a moment. So when we think about responsible breeding, if somebody says to you, what's a responsible breeder? I think for many of us, what will pop into our head is probably what's not a responsible breeder. We'll think about images of dogs being kept in intensive systems, often outdoors in unhygienic environments. But then if we think of the flip side of that, what's appropriate, we'll often then focus on environmental factors, both the physical, so thinking about things like physical and thermal comfort, and the social environment, so appropriate habituation and socialisation during a puppy's sensitive period for development, appropriate nutrition and preventative health care. And indeed, there are many millions of breeders across the world who adhere to these needs that are often written into countries' laws. But the question I think I'd pose tonight is if a breeder is still providing all of these important provisions for a dog's welfare, but isn't giving due respect or due regard to the dog's genetic health, can we still call them a responsible breeder? So going back to this graph from Lucy and colleagues, we can see that on the left, almost 3/4 of these disorders, or over 3/4 of these disorders, were not related to the body shape of the dog. They're instead thought to be related to inbreeding. And this is an inherent characteristic of breeding for pedigree dogs. We're breeding closed populations to try and improve the predictability of traits in offspring, whether that be their looks or their temperament or other traits. But unfortunately, closing gene pools then reduces genetic diversity, and it potentially increases the risk of genetic disease, which we'll explore now. In a very large study published just a couple of years ago, a group of geneticists looked at 152 known disease variants in the dog in a very large population of over 100,000 dogs, and looked at what type of inheritance those disorders had. And we can see here that over 80% of inherited disorders in the dog of this type are autosomal recessive. And there's always a question mark over, are mixed breed dogs more or less healthy than purebred dogs, with the assumption that purebred dogs are more unhealthy. And here there was an interesting result that mixed breed dogs are more likely to carry, so be a carrier of a common recessive disease, but purebreds were more likely to be genetically affected by one, so they're more likely to have 2 copies. And again, when we think about closed or open genetic populations of mixed breeds versus purebreds, we can imagine why. Now, for dogs with disorders not related to conformation, health testing has long been a mantra for responsible dog breeding. That will be used in adverts for dogs, that will be used as a way of promoting that you are a responsible breeder, and we'll explore that later. And of course, this is important in terms of increasing awareness of the potential genetic risks in both sires, so fathers and dams, mothers, before a mating decision is made. And again, we don't want breeders to be breeding blind, so not having any idea about what the genetic liabilities of the dogs that they breed have. And indeed, we don't want them to be actively putting their head in the sand and potentially knowing that there are genetic risks in their breed, but instead choosing to ignore them. And again, many of these common autosomal recessive disorders that have this Mendelian inheritance that we'll have all learned about in biology, it really shows how important it is to be aware, because there could be many carriers within a population, if you don't genetically test, that could unintentionally be bred together, leading to affected dogs. And there's many, many disorders that we've said that follow this inheritance pattern, some of which are incredibly rare or incredibly breed specific. I've just popped up a few here that might be more widely known. And again, just from this shortlist, you can see that quite a few of them are related to eye health, And just to flag this up, in the UK, there is a really comprehensive eye scheme run by the British Veterinary Association, the Kennel Club, and the ISDS, that again we can see over 65 breeds here are tested for over a dozen different eye diseases within this screening panel. And the number of genetic diseases and then the number of genetic tests out there for them is pretty overwhelming. And there's been some great work from this initial speaker in this series, Brenda Bonnet, working as CEO for the International Partnership for Dogs, working on this important project on harmonising genetic testing for dogs, because there are just so many offered by so many labs. And again, there's obviously many people out there to make money from tests that might not be valid or reliable in specific dogs. There have been lots of success stories from DNA testing of dogs to improve breed health. Just one example here in the miniature wire-haired dachshund in the UK. The miniature wire-haired dachshund is predisposed to a disorder called Lafora's disease, which is a neurological storage disorder where dogs have progressive epilepsy that unfortunately results in death. So again, the breed is very motivated to do something about that. And again, working with geneticists in Canada, identified the specific gene mutation and have then worked within their breed to reduce the prevalence of affected dogs. But again, trying to use carriers against dogs that were clear to try and increase or at least stabilise genetic diversity, which we'll talk about in a moment. So some of the benefits of genetic testing are that dogs can be non-invasively tested from puppyhood. We can have dogs swabbed pretty soon after birth. Again, for some breeders, they'll be doing that routinely in very young dogs. And importantly, well in advance of breeding decisions. And kennel clubs across the world, just using the UK example here as the most familiar one to me, often will sell genetic packages to carry out a number of what they might consider priority DNA tests, all from one swab, to save the breeders time, effort and money. And again, I've just highlighted here that this is also can be a selling point to potential buyers. And I'm sure you'll have heard of the concept of a dog being fully health tested or their parents being fully health tested. And that's something that I really hope by the end of tonight you are thinking about more critically, because it's a concept that is unfortunately somewhat bastardized in the breeding world. So ensuring that DNA testing isn't used as a smokescreen to claim breeding responsibility or good health of breeding dogs is really important here, because again, the genetic disorders of dogs are very diverse and some of them aren't amenable to DNA testing. Many disorders, as they are in humans, are polygenic and will have environmental factors involved, or are very closely linked to the body shape that we select dogs for. So I think we can only say that we're responsibly DNA testing if those are the key disorders in a breed and there aren't more prevalent or welfare impacts severe disorders in the breed that aren't being addressed. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago with the IPFD project, ensuring that a test is validated for the population tested in that breed population in that same country to make sure we're testing for the right thing is also key. So there are clearly some caveats here. There's also the question of what do breeders do with test results. So clearly a breeder can say, well, I've tested my dog for X, Y, Z. But it's important that they then potentially incorporate that into their breeding decisions. And as we mentioned a moment ago with Lafora's disease in the dachshund, maintaining carriers of recessive disorders in the population can help to reduce the loss of genetic diversity, which inherently in a closed population, as pedigree dogs are, will diminish over time. There's no way for that to increase without opening up these breed barriers, so allowing different genetic material into a breed through outcrossing. And again, it also relies on all breeding dogs then being tested, because if we're going to start using carriers, we need to know that whoever that dog is bred to is not also a carrier. So it requires a very high level of uptake and buy-in from breeders. It's also really complicated in terms of how do breeders balance the results of these types of tests against other breeding considerations. So Unfortunately, many pedigree dogs have multiple predispositions to disease. Sorry, my cat is going to join us extensively this evening. We also have to think about genetic diversity, and there are tools, including, as we've got here, Mate Select, which is run by the UK Kennel Club, to look at the coefficient of inbreeding of a proposed mate choice. So how closely related are those two individuals? And again, in the past, we've had what would be termed line breeding, where really high levels of inbreeding were common in some breeds, including mothers to sons, fathers to daughters, which is now banned by the UK Kennel Club, but also sibling matings, cousins or grandparents to grandchildren. We also have conformation-related health to think about in breeding decisions, and temperament. So there's an awful lot of things to balance up here. In terms of other potential tools for improving breeding decisions, there's also many disorders in dogs that aren't amenable to a single gene mutation test. And in the UK, the British Veterinary Association runs a canine health schemes programme that includes testing for heart disease, elbow and hip disease, eyes, as we've already seen, which includes both genetic swabs, but then also observation of eyes by a veterinary ophthalmologist, respiratory function, which we'll talk about later, and also neurological disease, including Curran malformations, syringomyelia. And as I said, there are some disorders that just aren't amenable to standard genetic testing. This study at the top looked at a single nucleotide polymorphism-based test for hip dysplasia. And as you can see here, it kind of turned out to be completely incapable of predicting canine hip dysplasia in their target population. In contrast, as I'm sure many of you are aware from the OFA in North America, that there has long been hip and elbow screening programs for a number of breeds, with breeders being encouraged to breed only from those dogs who have a score that is lower than the breed average. And in this paper, against the senior author here, Tom Lewis, who previously worked at the UK Kennel Club, stated that there was a declining genetic trend for hip scores and elbow grades in most breeds, which they thought implied improvement because of selection pressures from screening in those breeds. And this is a sometimes controversial area because many people would consider that the improvements haven't been quick enough for how long these schemes have been running for. And that's something that if anybody has any views on tonight would be interesting to share. So is health testing enough to improve breed health? I think with some caveats. So I think they need to meet certain criteria for health testing to be used responsibly, given that we're talking about responsible breeding today. So we need to have sufficient genetic diversity within a breed. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, right, we already have a really genetically throttled breed, and we're now only going to select for certain individuals that don't carry or aren't affected by certain conditions. In those situations, it might be more responsible to have some judicious outcrossing to replenish genetic diversity in a breed and to add in some healthy alleles where there are far too many carriers and affected dogs. Also need to consider that health problems aren't linked to the inherent conformation of a breed, so the shape that they're selected for, in this case where conformational change could improve welfare to either a greater extent or more rapidly. We need to think where testing targets the most pressing conditions within a breed where the most severe welfare impacts lie. So we shouldn't be reducing the population of a breed dramatically for a rare disorder that has little to no welfare impact. We need to be thinking about the most prevalent, severe and chronic conditions being pushed up that selection list. We also need to be careful that tests are not used to claim that a dog or its parents are fully health tested to potentially unknowing buyers if there's other health issues that aren't being addressed properly within that breed. And then finally, they need to be used as part of the balanced selection strategy, which we'll talk about more at the end. There are also many disorders in the domestic dog that are not related just to inbreeding or to specific genes, but are related to the shape that we select these dogs for. It could either be directly related to their conformation, or it could be that there's the condition that is inherited. In this case, we've got a dog with allergies, which are very common in some breeds. In this case, the Boston Terrier could be exacerbated by conformation. So we can see this dog is having real trouble with its skin fold here. And this is a concept that has been around for a long time. We can go back to papers from the 90s. I'm sure many or all of you will be aware of Paul McGreevy's work out in Australia. And again, come back to this paper and this quote time and time again, describing that some traits, so we think about conformational traits, are best regarded as defects and are difficult to defend on welfare grounds. And that's what I always come back and reflect on, is can we defend keeping a certain look in a dog for that dog's welfare? We also, again, back in the late 2000s, when we had this huge surge in attention in the UK, the RSPCA didn't pull their punches, said they were extremely concerned about the very high levels of disability, deformity and disease in pedigree dogs. But concerns go back far, far earlier than that. And indeed, we can also go back to Darwin back in the 1800s, who commented on the shape of the head and the jaw of the bulldog and of the pug. And I think, again, important here just to reflect on this last statement, to say a peculiarity suddenly arising and therefore in one sense and deserving to be called a monstrosity may, however, be increased and fixed by man's selection. So this curiosity that as the human race, when we see abnormality or oddity or extremes in animals, we often will grasp them and then breed from them. And indeed, we're talking about dogs tonight, but I could equally be talking about cats or indeed horses or other domestic species. And there are an awful lot of conformation-related disorders. As we saw earlier, there were at least 63 identified in the systematic review. This is a document from the UK Canine Feline Sector Group, who put out some guidance on conformation in dogs, highlighting some key conformation-related disorders. And we can see these are issues pretty much from head to tail. Some of them related to a dog's airway. So we can see here congenitally narrow nostrils. Some dogs having excessively prominent eyes, as we can see in this pug, or below in those images, eyes with eyelids that are not fit for function, where we either have eyelashes or fur either touching the eyelid rolling outwards, leading to excessively exposed conjunctiva, or combinations of both. We can see problems with skin disease, in the bottom left with bulldogs and other breeds that are bred for extreme and excessive wrinkling, and also the problems that come with being flat-faced. We've also got in the top right here the issues that have been quite high profile in the last 10 years in the UK with the German Shepherd dog, with musculoskeletal abnormalities leading to these dogs looking like they have a very sloped back and an abnormal gait. I think in the UK and in Europe right now, the poster boy, so to say, of conformation-related disorders are brachycephalic, we might call short-muzzled or flat-faced breeds. And again, I think in part because some of their issues are from head to tail, as we can see with this just little schematic here, that dogs, and this is a pug just to represent all brachycephalic breeds, have a real long list of issues that are directly related to the body shape that we select them for. And given that these are the most popular dog breeds in the UK right now, the French Bulldog is currently the most registered dog, with pugs and English Bulldogs in the top 10. And again, all three of those breeds featuring in the top 10 most popular dog breeds across much of the world. They have had a real attention put on them, particularly in the last 10 years. And we can see here that there is probably a disproportionate amount of arrows at the head and neck of these brachycephalic breeds. And that again, in part, would make sense when we think about what is the most extreme feature of these dogs, what is the most characteristic, and in this case, it is this dramatically foreshortened muzzle, where we have dogs that are bred for a much reduced facial skeleton, but the associated soft tissues are not proportionally reduced. So we have issues with skin, as we've seen with Bulldog before, where we almost have this concertinaing of skin on the face, leading to skin fold problems. We have a lot of issues with the eyes, again, where the eyeball, the globe, should be sat within the orbit, which should be deep like an ice cream scoop to hold the globe in place. But instead, in brachycephalic breeds, it's more like a teaspoon, very shallow, which means their eyes are exposed, which we like in many ways. We celebrate dogs for having that wide-eyed expression, but can lead to dogs who can't blink properly, who have chronically dry or irritated eyes, who develop corneal ulcers, and even end up with irritation from their eyes from their nasal fold, which is adjacent to it. The most common disorder that we talk about with brachycephalics is often their airway disorders, which again are strongly related to their face shape, which we'll explore in a moment. But more recently, and again, as Katie mentioned in A book that I co-authored and co-edited last year. The problems are from head to tail, and we're seeing more recently the recognition of issues such as vertebral malformations that result in that characteristic curly tail, or indeed in bulldogs and French bulldogs, a very short or absent tail, but also other issues like difficult whelping, so dystocia, obesity, and many other conditions. So we obviously need evidence to try and influence breeders' decisions and to try and influence potentially legislation where humans can't be persuaded to do the right thing by their dogs. In the UK at the RVC, we have Vet Compass, which is a large-scale epidemiological tool which covers over a third of UK vet clinics where we receive their clinical notes on a daily basis. Now we have over 200 million companion animals as part of this database, including over 521 million treatments. So we can have a really good picture of what dogs are being diagnosed with and treated for in the UK. And over the last 10 years, this has led to a very long list of disorders that have been found to be associated with the brachycephalic conformation itself, or have been found to be strongly predisposed in individual brachycephalic breeds, as we can see here. And again, some of these disorders we've just explored, including respiratory problems and heat stroke, multiple eye conditions, dermatological disease, also orthopedic conditions, obesity, dystocia, and even anal sac disorders. So again, it seems like there are issues with every part of these dogs' bodies. Going back 10 years now to my own PhD that brought me to the RVC, I was tasked with looking to quantify what we called healthy conformational limits. So how flat is too flat when it comes to a flat-faced dog? Where do the risks most strongly lie? And in this graph here, we can see that on the x-axis, we have how flat is a dog's face from 0, which would be a completely non-existent muzzle, through to 0.45, which should probably be the length of the muzzle of, say, an average boxer dog or a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. And again, we don't have the risk beyond there because the risk of airway obstruction syndrome in these dogs is non-existent. And then on the y-axis, we can see the probability of BOAS. And we can see as we work from right to left that this risk increases really dramatically as we get to the shorter face shapes, and is exacerbated by dogs having a thicker neck girth. And if we watch this animation here from my good colleague, Professor Claire Rusbridge, a renowned neurologist in the UK, we can see from these scans how the inherent anatomy of brachycephalic dogs is so dramatically changed by foreshortening their muzzle. So again, as we can imagine, in the flat face shape, there is very little space for the important anatomy, particularly behind the nose, which can affect thermoregulation, so increasing risk of heat stroke, but also potentially impeding the important olfactory abilities of the dog. This trend is across various brachycephalic dog breeds, and this is just to show the trend across some of the breeds that we sampled from, but also how some of these breeds are very much in the extreme end of conformation. So we can see with the pug here, with the red line, that the most moderate pug that we saw in this sample was only just over a craniofacial ratio of 0.2. So that's their muzzle being a fifth of the length of their cranium. So there's not much to play with in terms of moving towards a lower risk morphology. When we think about conformational limits, we can think about at what point would we say something is too short. And this is just, again, another way of looking at this data, that if we were to say that a cutoff of, for example, 0.2 was where we wouldn't want breeders to select beyond, we would reduce the bulk of these breeds that are in the extremely high risk or high risk categories. But unfortunately, again, if we look, there's very few of some of these breeds, or none in the case of the Pekingese, that exist beyond this limit, which means that we are effectively then banning those breeds unless they choose to outcross to replenish both their genetic diversity and have a wider conformational spectrum. So because, again, breeders are very wed to the shape of their dogs, again, when we think about brachycephalic breeds, they are primarily being selected for their looks, and I'll explore some data on that I collected in a moment. But again, because these dogs are being bred for a very characteristic look, breeders are often very motivated to try and keep the conformation but find tests to reduce the burden of disease in these breeds. And in the last 5 years, the team at the University of Cambridge have worked with the Kennel Club to develop a BOAS screening programme to look at dogs both pre and post exercise to rate their respiratory noise, inspiratory effort and respiratory distress, either at rest or following a short exercise challenge. And again, this has had some uptake from breeders, particularly in the show community, trying to select from those dogs that have the least impact of their conformation on their respiratory system. And as we can see on the right here, this is from the Kennel Club accompanying guidance that dogs that are unaffected, so in their studies all non-brachycephalic dogs would fall into grade 0, can be bred from, but indeed some dogs in grade 1 and 2, so dogs who are clinically affected by their by BOAS, can be bred from, in particular pairings with less affected dogs. And I think that's a big question mark here, and it comes into some of the legislation we'll talk about later in terms of, are we not being ambitious enough for these breeds if we're saying that we should still breed from affected animals? I think a little bit more about this concept of health testing and how it's used by breeders to try and promote breed health, but also to try and promote their own dogs. And these are adverts I've literally just picked out of the Kennel Club's Find a Puppy tool just this week to give some exemplars of dogs that are currently for sale and the health tests that they've had carried out. So this little pug here, who's currently for sale in the UK, and this at the bottom is the mother of a recent litter of bulldog puppies in the UK. And you'll see that they're both advertised as health tested. This is an optional icon on the right, and in the text accompanying them, it says that in both cases their parents have been health tested. So when I see this, I always think, well, what have you been health tested for? So in the case of this pug, its mum had gone through the breeding scheme that I've just mentioned, the respiratory function grading, and was a grade 1, so was affected, but at the lowest level. Their dad hadn't gone through that testing scheme, but had had a pug dog encephalitis DNA test and had a result of being at minimal risk. And if we look at the Kennel Club's Assured Breeder Scheme in the UK, so this is an optional scheme that breeders can take part in, that means that they are more closely vetted in terms of what they do with the rearing of their dogs. The only compulsory requirement for breeding dogs under this scheme is the respiratory function grading. So in this case, this breeder was not part of this. There are some other recommended health screenings, including breed club initiatives. And I think here I just wanted to flag up that this is clearly that there are breeders who are performing health tests, who are engaging in health tests. But then when we look at the most pressing disorders in these breeds, so in this case, we've got data from Vet Compass for the pug. This data were just presented last week at BSAVA, the UK Veterinary Conference, that we can see that some of the most important disorders include BOAS. So again, that correlates with the Kennel Club's requirements here, as are stenotic nares, so narrowed nostrils associated with BOAS. But we can see a really high predisposition of corneal ulcerations, so eye disease, again related to the shape of the eye and the eyelid, skin fold dermatitis, again related to the pronounced over nose wrinkle or nose rope that we see in pugs, and ear disease. So again, we have to think about, are we pressing in the right places with our selection decisions and our selection pressures? Similarly with this bulldog, again, one of its parents had been respiratory function tested, and both of its parents were what is known as hereditary clear for a disorder of uric acid production, which can lead to stones in the bladder and kidneys. And in this case, both of this dog's parents were clear based on their parents' genetics. But again, if we look at what the bulldogs are affected by, same study designed by Vet Compass, the most pressing issues include skin fold dermatitis, cherry eye, so prolapse of the third eyelid gland, the malformation of bulldogs' bottom jaws, which again is an inherent feature of the breed, airway disease, and interdigital cysts, so a foot problem. So it's interesting in terms of thinking about, are selection pressures in the right place? And I think myself and others within the pedigree dog and the dog breeding and welfare world are now calling more for moderation to fix these problems, that we believe that you can't just health test out of issues that are so closely linked to body shape, and that instead advocating for moderation could fix these problems both more rapidly, because we would be adding in more phenotypic diversity. When we think back to that chart, that some of these breeds are very cookie cutter, they have very little variation, for example, in face shape, particularly with the pug. And also it means that we can think more about genetic diversity, that we wouldn't just be selecting for the best of a population of affected dogs, potentially with very few clear, while also throttling genetic diversity. And the top row here, we can see just from the past 3 years, best of breed winners of our 3 numerically largest brachycephalic breeds in the UK, but then some recent projects across Europe to try and have alternatives to them. So in Germany and in continental Europe, we have retro mops, so retro pugs who are bred for a longer muzzle and reduced nasal folds, and again, clearer eyes that aren't as prominent and are able to fully close over the cornea. In the middle, we've got the Continental Bulldog, again, a project largely from Switzerland. Again, recognisably a bulldoggy type breed, but far more athletic in its shape, and again, some of the same moderation features of the pug. And then lastly, this French Bulldog, again, another brindle here with the characteristic ears, but again, a thinner neck, important again as a risk factor for boas, and also a cleaner face with less folds and tighter eyes. So what are the barriers to change? If we know that for some breeds that moderation has the potential to improve multiple important and pressing breed-related health conditions, why is this not happening? And again, this has been a labour of love of mine over the last few years, trying to understand the owners and breeders of brachycephalic dogs. And this is just, in a nutshell, some of the key areas that I think have led to this headline at the top, that French Bulldogs overtake Labradors as the UK's most popular dog breed, striking fear into my heart that owners of brachycephalic breeds prioritise their dog's appearance over their health or longevity compared to non-brachycephalic breeds. We've shown this in a UK study sample. The owners also normalise signs of ill health in their dog. So, for example, some of the classic respiratory signs, such as noisy, abnormal respiratory noise, such as snoring, even when the dog isn't asleep, are normalised or even celebrated within these breeds, again taking off the pressure to try and reduce this as a health problem. Owners also deflect breed-related health problems onto other members of their breed and overestimate their own dog's individual health, thinking that their dog is healthier than average for the breed. Indeed, only 7% of brachycephalic dog owners think that their dog is less healthy than average for the breed, which statistically cannot be true. We also have the recommendation of pathological traits. So exercise intolerance, again, a key clinical sign of brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome. In a qualitative study that I carried out a couple of years ago, was celebrated instead as a dog with a low exercise requirement, suited to people with little living space, little time to walk their dog, people who have a very busy lifestyle or are disabled. And then lastly, the owners of brachycephalic breeds are really strongly emotionally bonded with them. And particularly female owners and child-free owners. And this is a real barrier because it means that conversations around breed health are incredibly emotionally driven, and we have some strong processes of cognitive dissonance that we're trying to face. I'll try and finish up in just a moment, but I think it would be remiss to not mention that in the last few years, there's been an increased focus on legislative approaches to improving breeding, to try and make breeding more responsible. We've seen in the UK headlines around whether we should be banning some of breeds that have such intractable or such common and severe health problems. And this concept has been around for some time. I mentioned earlier, in Switzerland, there has been strong moves under the Qualzucht or torture breeding laws in different parts of Europe. And under these legislation, it's a crime to breed animals with the knowledge that their offspring are likely to suffer. So, for example, from genetic disorders. And I thought I'd bring in something that wasn't a dog briefly, but in Switzerland, just a few years ago, 2 breeders of Persian cats that we've got diagrams of on the right in terms of how severe brachycephaly can be in cats and its impact on their anatomy were convicted under the Swiss Animal Welfare Act, which stipulates that breeding is prohibited in which pain, suffering, damage or behavioural disturbances are caused by the breeding objective, or that related pain must be expected. We've seen this again more recently in the Netherlands, where the Dutch government have made moves to prohibit the breeding of dogs whose muzzles are too short. And again, you'll have seen some of my PhD research a few slides ago, which strongly influenced this legislation, where they decided to set conformational limits, in this case, saying that dogs with a craniofacial ratio of less than 0.3, so a muzzle a third of the length of their cranium, shouldn't be bred from. We should instead be aiming for dogs that have a muzzle of over 0.5. And again, that's quite dramatic in the sense that it does mean that effectively probably 20 different breeds would either be banned or would have dramatic conformational changes imposed upon them. And again, there are some caveats here in terms of promoting outcrossing, so allowing some of the flatter-faced breeds that fall into these danger zones to be bred with dogs with longer muzzles, and also looking at other important conformational traits like nasal folds being present, again, which is a risk factor for both skin disease and eye disease. Thinking about the appearance of the eye, so exposed eye white, which again in some of my other research was found to be related to the risk of corneal ulcers. So again, a totally different approach here. And then most recently, there was a court case in Norway back in last November, the result of which was announced just last month, that effectively banned the breeding of British Bulldogs and Cavalier King Charles Spaniels in Norway, again under their Animal Welfare Act, under specifically their statement 25, that breeding shall encourage characteristics which give robust animals which function well and have good health. And again, as we can see in this headline from a British newspaper, that the group who are taking these dogs, breeders, both the Norwegian Kennel Club and specific breeders, to court, say that there are currently no animals in Norway that could be classed as healthy under the Animal Welfare Act. Finally, just a reflection on my own country. In the UK, it's thought that there's sufficient legal provision to exist in the UK to provide protection of welfare related, in this case I'm saying, to brachycephalic dogs, but also to other conformational extremes. And actually it's more the enforcement than the wording of the legislation itself that needs to be looked at. And again, under our animal welfare legislation, it states that no dog may be kept for breeding if it can be reasonably be expected on the basis of its genotype, conformation, behaviour or state of health, that breeding from it could have a detrimental effect on its health or welfare, or the health or welfare of its offspring. So this last clause being very important in terms of thinking about the genetic health of its progeny. Again, we're waiting for a test case in the UK to see whether this legislation can be implemented to improve or indeed stop the breeding of brachycephalic dogs in the UK. I just thought I'd flag up here because we talked a lot about the puppies and passing on disorders, but one of the statements within that was also that breeding from it, in this case the animal, I'd like to call it an it, could have a detrimental effect on its health or welfare. And there's pretty damning evidence that in multiple brachycephalic breeds that the risk of having a difficult birth, so dystocia, and the necessity for a caesarean section is very high, likely related to what's called feto-pelvic disproportion, where the head and shoulders of the puppy, which again in the bulldog are bred to be very broad and proportionally large, are too large to pass through the birth canal. And again, in multiple studies, including reports from the Kennel Club themselves on the left, and also in Vet Compass studies looking at data from emergency clinics, that several breeds, including the Boston Terrier, Bulldog and French Bulldog, are heavily predisposed to having difficulties giving birth. And then if they do have these challenges, they are more likely to end up having to have a caesarean section to deliver the puppies and to try and improve the welfare and reduce the suffering of both the mum and the puppies. So just to finish, I think we also need to think about, are there other routes? The legislative route is very controversial in that obviously there's many people who love these dogs right now. They are out there in their millions. So looking for other ways to try and improve their welfare without effectively banning them is also being strongly looked into. So we have to think about the demand side of the equation, because we've talked very strongly about the supply side for this talk today. And dogs are very much in demand right now. With the pandemic over the last 2 years, we've seen international surges in the popularity of people wanting puppies, either adopting dogs from shelters. We saw early data coming out of Israel on that, but also the pandemic puppy phenomenon, so people seeking to buy a puppy, particularly during periods of lockdown or stay-at-home orders, not just in the UK, but for example in Australia and Germany. And we carried out some work on this over the past 2 years as part of our Pandemic Puppies team at RVC, to try and see whether if we can change buyer behaviours to improve breeding decisions. So can buyers be the driving force in dogs being bred more responsibly? But unfortunately, the pandemic has had the opposite effect to what we might want to see. We've seen fewer puppies being seen with their mother at sale and fewer puppies being visited in person prior to purchase, which increases the likelihood of owners being duped by puppy farmers, puppy traders and puppy importers, again with no regard for the welfare of the puppies or their mothers. We've also seen a reduction in owners who have sought to buy a puppy from a Kennel Club assured breeder, so this slightly higher welfare assurance scheme. We've also seen a reduction in owners who are looking for breeders who carry out genetic tests, and we've also seen an increase in puppies who are being sold at 8 weeks or less with a passport, which again implies that they've been imported from the EU, and in many cases underage, because of rabies vaccination laws they should be a minimum of 15 weeks. So it's a pretty challenging situation where we want to be able to enact owner pressure to improve breeding decisions, to have a market for healthy dogs and particularly a strong market for responsible dog breeders. But unfortunately, that side is also letting the dogs down right now. So just to finish, what does responsible breeding for health look like? In my mind, and again, I'm sure everybody here has different opinions, I'm really interested to hear them. I think fundamentally it has to prioritise sound conformation to enable that dog to achieve good welfare. That needs to be prioritised above human desires for looks. And as such, a responsible breeder should strive for moderation over extremes, given that we know extremes are associated with the highest disease risks. We need breeders that will use evidence to target the most pressing welfare concerns in their breed, and also take the level of inbreeding in their breed and the genetic diversity into account when they're selecting for dams and studs, so we're not ever more throttling genetic diversity and potentially collecting up more and more of these recessive mutations. Responsible breeders should use genetic testing where it's appropriate and available for a disease to reduce the risk of genetic diseases that fit with these criteria of being common, severe and potentially chronic. But they also need to be open to using other methods like outcrossing to achieve, for example, lower risk conformations in those extreme breeds, or boost genetic diversity in those breeds with the most limited gene pools. I think this is important because breeding sets the blueprint for that dog's lifelong health and welfare, as we had right at the start when we looked at the life cycle of these dogs, that being born into a poorly bred, inbred body can have really severe future welfare consequences. And that although science has offered many tools for modern and engaged dog breeders to be more aware, so to take their blindfold off, selection involves really complex prioritisation decisions that at the moment are pretty poorly understood in terms of our understanding of why breeders choose, for example, to do certain tests or to choose certain individuals to breed from. And I think that needs to be looked into more. Some health tests, again, probably a slightly controversial statement, might not materially improve breed health, or at worst could damage future population health. And I think this concept of fully health tested is one that needs to be really shook up, because again, it might be at worst, it could be at best meaningless, and at worst actually be harmful to genetic health. And I think responsible breeders for health, breeding for health requires buy-in from breeders, so they can use the science available, understand which are most important for their breed, but also out of the box thinking. So forgetting, or at least trying to push away from these closed gene pools and thinking about outcrossing, thinking about moderating conformational extremes. But also demand for healthy puppies from prospective owners is needed to raise breeding standards. And that's an area that really is ripe for more work. So we actually have both healthy supply and demand. And again, I think in some cases, at present, or in many cases at present, the above 3 criteria are missing, and there does appear to be a growing case for legislative approaches where breeders and buyers aren't sufficiently advocating for the welfare of the dogs. So I'm going to finish up there because I've definitely gone over, and I apologise because I could talk about this forever. Just want to say thank you to all the funders of the work that I've talked about. My contact details here on Twitter and via email, always welcome to chat about this topic more. Plugging our book, and of course my lovely colleague Dan, who I co-edited it with. Also thanks to the Vet Compass team that he leads, the Pandemic Puppies team at RVC. So welcome any and all questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Packer. That was a really nice summary of a very complex topic. So you covered a lot of ground, and that was a nice way also to end the series, I think, because you gave us a lot to think about. I will ask a question while we wait for others to put their questions in the Q&A box. I have a couple questions actually, but I think I'll ask one more related to kind of differing perspectives across countries. So obviously I'm in Canada, there's others on this call from different countries. And it sounds like the UK has been thinking about this a lot. Is this something that in your experience, are there other countries that are viewing this differently? So for example, what's been your experience with North American perspectives on this compared to the UK?
I think the UK, as we say, we have been thinking about this a lot, particularly for the last kind of 10 to 15 years. There's been increasing literature coming out of the UK and increasing, I guess, advocacy and action from not just academics like myself, but very much from animal welfare charities, veterinary organisations. There's a far more joined up approach. So we have, for example, in the UK, a Brachycephalic working group that includes many of the key stakeholders. And I think that is partly responsible for that ongoing dialogue where when these issues first came into a head, lots of these groups weren't talking, and I think that's possibly the case in some other countries. I'm really interested about North America because, of course, there are huge numbers of dogs and huge numbers of some of these high-risk breeds. And I'm always fascinated, particularly in countries with much nicer climates than the UK, how some of these dogs fare, particularly dogs that are at risk of heat stroke, and whether they are inherently healthier. Otherwise, are they collapsing everywhere? So I think I'd like to see more potential engagement from North America on some of these issues because, again, their veterinary literature seems to imply that the same issues exist. And I think a more joined up international approach is important. There is a group on international extremes that brings together multiple working groups from mainly across Europe. And I think there's lots of opportunities to use kind of the blueprints of these kind of working groups that have popped up across Europe and to set them up in other countries. We've had have requests for that quite often. Just a couple of weeks ago, had requests from Australia about how can they start having this more joined up thinking, or at least joined up dialogue. So yeah, I think that in its own right is controversial because some groups would say that leads to a kind of consensus view, which can often muddy the waters or can kind of homogenize people's views, where actually each different group might have different, subtly or dramatically different views. But I think just getting that dialogue running between different groups within your country that have a vested interest in dog breeding is a really good first step.
Great, thank you. We do have another question. Specific breed banning seems quite controversial, but seeing some of that is happening right now in Europe. Have there been any studies that have measured the success of more informal buyer beware campaigns regarding health challenges of specific breeds?
No, I think that's really important because I think there have been so many campaigns now. We had in the UK with the RSPCA about 10 years ago, Bred for Looks, Born to Suffer in Australia, Love is Blind. And again, the campaigns that go out to the general public, but quite often there isn't that follow-up to see how public opinion changes. Most recently in the UK, the Blue Cross, another animal welfare charity, have been quite strongly messaging on this, and I think are being a little bit more reflective in their cycle of seeing what impacts that has. has. But I think that is an important step. There was a paper published just a couple of weeks ago on and within veterinary practice intervention, looking at providing owners of various breeds with a little bit of information, in this case about boas, and to see whether that impacted whether that individual would think about buying that breed either again, or whether they would buy that breed at all if they weren't brachycephalic owners in the future. And it had a moderate effect, but it's never as big an effect as people would want or hope. And I think in part that is some of those psychological barriers, and particularly this normalization phenomena where we're just used to seeing dogs that look different. We don't see it as weird. And also seeing dogs that are unwell. You know, we're used to seeing and hearing dogs that are snoring, snorting. We see them on TV adverts. You know, most recently there was the Xbox or PlayStation game Halo used the sound recordings of a pug as an alien race within their game, and again that really strongly stamped down of people saying it's not appropriate for you to be using a very unwell animal to make money and to joke about it. But yeah, sorry, I digress. I'll go on about this forever. But I think there needs to be more nuanced human behaviour change interventions where we have that evaluation aspect, because if we aren't going down a legislative route, the traditional campaigning and education just hasn't worked to the extent anybody would have hoped.
Well, it sounds like an excellent opportunity for further qualitative research. It sounds like your group is doing a lot of already. Another question about the role of dog shows. So what role do you think that plays in some of the perspectives on these dogs?
I think it plays a role. I don't think it's as big as lots of people or the public might anticipate, because again, the show communities are a relatively small part of the wider breed communities, particularly for these breeds that have now boomed to having, you know, hundreds of thousands of dogs being bred per year. I think in part we often talk about them as it's almost that's the blueprint. So what you see in the show ring has the potential to be copied outside of the show ring. There's not strong data on that, but that's one of the kind of hypotheses, that if dogs that were being bred for pet homes looked wildly different to those dogs that are being bred under the Kennel Club banner, and particularly under the showing banner, that might be less popular. But I'm not sure that's true. I think one of my hopes is that the pet market, so people who just want pet versions of some of these extreme breeds, would be far more willing to accept a much more moderate version, because they're not pushing for breed standard adherence. They probably don't even know what a breed standard is. So I think breed standards are important because on paper, I mean, even when we think about it legally, some of them are advocating or recommending features that are counter to animal welfare. You know, anyone that has a nose roll, there's no welfare grounds to defend having excessive skin on your face. It doesn't benefit that animal anyway, but it puts it at risk of skin and eye disease. Those documents are important from that perspective, that they're advocating a healthy blueprint, but I think the influence of them on the general public is less than people have previously anticipated.
And maybe just a follow up to that, in terms of the Kennel Club and your experience with the Kennel Club in the UK, what's been their perspective on outcrossing, for example, as a possible solution for some of these problems?
It's permitted, and again, I think that they're open to it. But the challenge is that outcrossing can't just be an individual decision of one breeder saying, I'm going to start outcrossing my pug with Jack Russells and I'm going to start breeding in longer muzzles or more athletic body shape. It has to be a greater movement within a breed, again, to maintain that genetic diversity, so we don't have just these tiny little bubbles of outcrosses. And needs to be a really well thought out program. That's not to say that I wouldn't advocate for it, because I really strongly would. I think it's a really strong way of replenishing both phenotypic and genetic diversity, but there needs to be breeders that want to do it. And I think it's not the Kennel Club itself, it's breeders who have the dogs who make those decisions that need to be brought on board. And I think in parts of what we've seen in the Netherlands, and we obviously need to see how that will work, because these laws are all very, very, very recent to know what impact they'll have. But that, again, is trying to push for breeders to outcross, to get to healthier conformational limits and to reduce disease risk. But again, we need to see whether that actually translates to people doing that, or do they just leave the breed entirely? Do they start registering their dogs in a different country? There's always loopholes, and I don't like to focus strongly on loopholes because it feels it can feel like everything's futile. Then it can feel, you can become very cynical and say, well, there'll always be a get out clause, there'll always be a way of people having dogs that have these challenges. But I think we need to try and concentrate on how we can positively get people to engage with improving welfare instead.
We are at the top of the hour, but there are a couple of more questions. So as long as you're willing to stay on, we can finish those up. So the next one is, how can you support reliable breeders to stay in the breed and keep doing good work?
That's a really good question. I think we do need to do that. We need to be celebrating good breeders. And I think in part, and I'll probably get hit by a few people for this, but the mantra of adopt, don't shop, I totally get the sentiment. You know, I've got, where's gone now, a rescue staffy somewhere. So, you know, the poster child of the unwanted rescue dog. But I think celebrating good breeders who do a good job for their dog's health and welfare, including their behavioural health and welfare too, is something that we should be more proud to do as a society, because as we've seen with the pandemic, there are a huge number of people that want dogs. That you have more dogs, I think, in North America than we do in Europe, more per household, and more households have at least one dog, and that supply has to come from somewhere, and it will quite happily be filled by puppy farmers, by illegal puppy traders, by puppy importers. So actually finding and celebrating people who do the right thing by their dog. It might not have everything is perfect, and I think the obsession with absolutely every box being ticked is a challenge, because it means that we've got like a very polarized system. Either we say you have to go to an assured breeder, or what's the opposite? We're going to end up with an imported puppy from Eastern Europe, at least in the UK. So that middle ground of solid breeders who are well socialising their puppies, who are making some considered responsible breeding choices, I think as a society we need to focus on them more. And I think we need to learn a little bit more about how puppy buyers perceive risk of buying puppies from poor systems, because my perception is that lots of, at least in the UK, owners have no idea of the strong involvement of organised crime in the puppy trade. You know, the top three kind of organised crime areas include drugs and puppies, which, how do they go hand in hand? I don't think many people are aware of, when they're going out to buy a puppy, that there's a huge likelihood of them buying from a source that is illegal and has had no regard to that dog's welfare. So celebrating the middleman, I'm very, very passionate about. So I think there's more in terms of how animal welfare charities message on that, not demonising people for breeding, because as I said, puppies have to come from somewhere, and making buyers more aware that there's lots of things that they can do in terms of avoiding red flags to go to your potentially home breeder who's doing as much as they can to provide good welfare for their dogs. Sorry, I like a ramble.
No, that's good. So one last question. This is a nice one to end on. It's your future prediction. So what's your prediction if we continue to go down this road of breeding for extreme conformation? Will certain breeds become even more untenable?
I think it's becoming a bit of an arms race, and I think we're seeing it actually right now. Even in the last few years, there's been some developments. So we've just in the UK seen a huge spike in the use of canine fertility clinics. So I mentioned that, for example, in some of the extreme bulldog breeds, so including the English bulldog and the French bulldog, but also what we'd have as things like XL bullies, micro bullies, lots of very masculine looking, very well muscled dogs that have challenges breeding. We're having illegal AI clinics, so artificial insemination clinics, to try and overcome some of those challenges of dogs that either can't mate effectively or can't give birth effectively. And I think that's been a big and shocking step in the UK, that's kind of the next way of getting more of these dogs produced and sold at sometimes really obscene figures. Again, often questioning whether that is kind of money laundering. We also are seeing, as I said, more extreme versions of breeds. So if you want to be horrified, to like Google something like toad line bulldog. So we're seeing dogs that are being bred with really distorted skeletons, very short and twisted legs. Again, many of them are mutilated, so we'll have ears and tails docked. So I do think we're seeing this ramping up of what is extreme, and it frustrates me in part because what we're seeing, even what we're seeing in the show ring, is extreme by biological standards. But now there's another scapegoat of saying, yeah, but we're not as bad as these guys. And yeah, perhaps you're not, but the whole area is at risk. So my prediction is more of humans being happy to intervene to allow where biology says no, humans say yes, and also just moving on to other extreme breeds. So in the UK, for example, the pug has kind of plateaued in popularity more recently. It doesn't seem to be having the same surge that it was 10 years ago. And we're seeing other breeds like the dachshund, so sausage dogs, really pushing up in popularity. And I mentioned them as a success case for Lafauré's disease earlier, but we've also got the pretty awful statistic that 1 in 4 of them will experience an intervertebral disc extrusion herniation event in their life that causes many of them to be paralysed temporarily or permanently, which is a huge challenge when we're now seeing huge numbers of these dogs coming through. And I think it's so bizarre, but also so concerning that as humans, we're attracted to the oddities of the animal kingdom, where if we could just be more satisfied with a proportional animal, then we'd be saving ourselves a lot of money and heartache. And you'd also be putting people like me and Dan out of a job, but I think we'd be quite happy to.